This is the Macintosh Performa 575. It is very obviously one of Apple's mid-1990s all-in-one computers, and it was aimed at relatively higher-end home users. And like most computers that Apple was making in this era, it uses a Motorola 68040 processor. But not just the regular 68040. It actually uses the version called the 68LC040. And that is a processor, the LC in the model number indicates that it was the low-cost version of the processor. And the reason it was low cost is because it did not include a special hunk of processing logic that is typically known as a floating point unit. And in the 80s and early 90s, it wasn't uncommon for Intel and Motorola and other processor manufacturers to market professional level processors as a separate entity from their consumer level processors. And it wasn't usually only just the clock speed of the chip that made the difference between consumer and pro. It was also the presence or lack of a floating point unit. The floating point units were essentially a built-in coprocessor. Sometimes they weren't even built in. Sometimes they were literally a separate chip that would ride alongside the CPU. That seemed to have been more common on the Intel-compatible side of the world. But in any case, the floating point unit was a little bundle of discrete logic that was specially designed to handle and perform floating point mathematical functions and to do it much more quickly than a more general purpose CPU could do. For consumer level applications, an FPU or floating point unit wasn't such a big deal. Very few typical home user style applications would take advantage of one, and typically you wouldn't see it being a requirement for games or desktop publishing apps or things like that. But on the more professional end of the spectrum, particularly or specifically for software that really needed to burn through large quantities of floating point mathematical operations, having an FPU was a tremendous performance improvement. It was a big deal. This is something that PC users would have seen reflected in the Intel chips of that era. So think the Intel 486. There were 486 processors that had FPUs built in, and then 486 processors that didn't, and they were typically differentiated by the acronym or the letters SX or DX. SX meaning the lower cost version. If you had a 486DX, you had a big beefy CPU that could do standard math and floating point math. So same concept applied on the Apple and Motorola side of the fence with the low cost or LC versions of these chips. Now, for me, part of the fun of owning these vintage computers is getting to experience what life was like as a owner-operator of one of these machines in the era in which it was relevant. But another big part of my enjoyment of these computers is in the sort of role-playing aspect. I'm doing this stuff in the 2020s, and so for me, I can pick up a machine like this and upgrade it with technology that would have been prohibitively expensive or didn't exist at all in the era in which this machine was relevant. So an easy example of that, this computer doesn't actually have a hard drive in it. It's actually booting from an SD card using a little adapter called a SCSI to SD adapter. And that essentially creates a solid-state drive for a computer that was released in the era decades before solid-state drives in the modern sense even existed. So a big part of the fun for me is in getting to take a machine like this and push it as far as it can go, in some cases farther than it was ever meant to go. Now, this computer right now is running the low-cost version of that CPU that I'd mentioned before, the 68040. And I want to get to play around with some of that higher end or more professional level software from the early 90s that expects to have an FPU. It expects or needs to use a floating point unit to work. And even back in the early 90s, there were ways around this. There was actually a popular piece of shareware that would essentially use the main standard processor, the CPU, to emulate a floating point unit. And so you could run a soft FPU as a control panel on your Mac, and it would allow you to run those programs that required a floating point unit but the performance was awful because you were taking a general purpose CPU and forcing it to do a kind of math that it was very literally not designed for. So you could theoretically or technically run those applications that required an FPU, but the performance was so bad that you were unlikely to get much done or enjoy doing that work. So I want to get to play around with some of that software. As an example, on one of my old Mac Addict magazine CD-ROMs, I found this demo for a 3D design program called Extreme 3D. But when I try to run it on my Performa 575, it starts to load, but then I get an error message saying, user interface system alert, Extreme 3D needs a floating point unit to speed math computations. It's not an option, it's a requirement. And yeah, I could install one of those floating point unit emulators and sort of trick the software into loading, but it wouldn't be representative of what the software could actually do. The performance would be abysmal, and it just wouldn't be a lot of fun. So I'm going to upgrade the CPU in this machine because these Motorola 68LC04D processors, they were socketed. They're not soldered onto the motherboard. They sit in a little socket, not unlike what a modern CPU does in a modern desktop PC. So you might notice right here, I actually have a full-fledged 68040 running at the same 33 megahertz that this one's already running at, but in this case, there's no LC in the model number. It's the full blast 68040. Now this one is actually a sample. Like literally, it's actually stamped with sample on the CPU die. And I believe that means that this was produced by Motorola in a batch of test units, but the person I bought it from assured me that it's a legit, fully functional CPU. So I'm going to throw it in my Performa and see if I can actually get some of these applications that require an FPU to run and let me play with some of this software that's otherwise sort of outside the bounds of what this consumer level machine was designed for. So we're going to switch gears. I'm going to rearrange my setup a little bit, and I'm going to use the special tool that the person who sold me the CPU actually loaned me. I need to send this back to him, so thank you, Old Pigeon, for loaning me your extremely uncommon CPU pry bar. I'll get some close-up images of this to put into the video, but it's just a little piece of metal at a funky angle with a comb of teeth along the edge of it, but that will allow me to literally pry up the original CPU, pop it out of the socket, and then lower this one in its place. So follow along, should be an interesting project. Once I've got the CPUs swapped out, I'm going to try launching some of these applications again, like Extreme 3D, and we'll see if it'll load now that the computer should have a CPU that includes a floating point unit. So stick around, should be interesting. All right, let's get the motherboard out of the machine and see if we can do this CPU upgrade now. So I'm disconnecting my accessories so I don't break anything. One of the difficulties of this particular era of Apple computers is that they were made out of this ABS plastic. I think that's the right acronym. And in addition to slowly turning sort of a gross color, gross shade of yellow over time, this used to be a much nicer flat gray. More concerningly, this plastic is incredibly brittle. It would be more accurate to describe it as having a texture or a tensile strength closer to baked clay or something like that. So I've already broken various pieces of this computer in the time that I've owned it just by touching it too hard. So I'm going to be extremely gentle as I try to move this thing around because it's heavy. There's a built-in CRT monitor and various pieces inside. The motherboard sits in the bottom of the machine. There's a lot of load that this plastic enclosure is trying to maintain. So it is at risk of collapsing under its own weight. So I want to be very gentle with it as I proceed here. Disconnecting Ethernet, disconnecting power, disconnecting my keyboard cable, which I'm just going to move out of the way entirely. And now we can swing the machine around, and as I swing it around, you might actually notice on the back, here is the SCSI to SD adapter that I'd mentioned before. This is what's allowing the computer to use a modern micro SD card as a solid-state drive. So that's where I have my Mac OS System 7 installed. So I'm going to move that out of the way. And now that all of the cables are out of the machine, and I have it resting on this fabric pad just to make it easier to slide it around, Very, very carefully, I'm going to remove the back plastic plate, which is not held in by screws. It's just one little tab. The other tab already snapped off. Again, very brittle plastic. I'm hoping I can remove this without further damaging it. There we go. That's out. And now we see the actual motherboard, along with the empty bay where the hard drive used to be. This is where the SCSI hard drive would have slid in. I'd have to double check, but I think the machine originally shipped with a 160 megabyte hard drive. Now I have gigabytes of solid state storage in that tiny little micro SD card, so welcome to the future. And now I can just slide the motherboard out of the machine very gently. There's no hook or handle, so I have to just pull on the components, but that's okay. And now, there we go. That is the motherboard for the Performa 575, including the Motorola LC040 processor right here. And that's the piece that I'm going to try to swap out right now using that little pry tool that the member of the Macintosh Liberation Army forum loaned me when he sold me the replacement CPU. So here goes nothing. Alright, so here we go. Once again, we have the motherboard of the Performa 575 pulled out of the machine. And now that we're a little bit closer up, you might as well take a closer look at it. So we've got some ports along the back of the motherboard. We've got an ADB port, that's Apple Desktop Bus. That's the peripheral and accessory port that Macs of this era used to connect keyboards and mice and some other accessories, dial-up modems, some of them connected over, or maybe got power over ADB. Right next to the ADB port, we see two serial ports, one typically assigned to a printer, the other typically assigned to a dial-up modem. Then we have this big 25-pin port. This is the external SCSI port. So this would have been used for things like external hard drives, scanners, CD-ROM drives, external CD-ROM drives, that kind of thing. Anything requiring a whole lot of bandwidth relative to what this era of computer could manage. And then over here, you'll notice I have an add-on card, which I can just pop off right now so you can see what that looks like. Hopefully I don't murder my computer as I do this. So these computers had an interesting feature, which is that they had this big block of ports right here, and these are known as a PDS, or Processor Direct Slot. And there's also this smaller brown socket that looks a little bit like a PCI socket, but it's not. This was known as a COM slot for communications, and then this was a Processor Direct Slot for literally going direct to the processor. Every pin on this slot directly correlates to one of the pins on the CPU. But because not every Mac had a COM slot and not every Mac had a PDS slot, it was a little bit of a crapshoot which thing your particular model of Mac would have. So manufacturers of accessories and add-on boards, they offered upgrades that would work in different slots depending on what kind of Mac you had. Because this Mac has both, I could have gone either way, but Mac Effects on the Mac Liberation Army forum was kind enough to sell me an Ethernet card that happens to use the PDS slot. So that's what was sitting in this spot when we started the video here. So I'm just going to put that off to the side for now so I don't inadvertently crunch it while I'm popping out the CPU. Once again, this is the CPU. This is the low-cost edition of the 33 megahertz 68040 CPU. Right over here is a little barrel battery that Apple and a lot of other computer manufacturers in the mid-90s used to preserve things like the date and time in between power cycles. And there are other functions, BIOS settings, things like that, that a parameter RAM or PRAM battery would maintain. So even though this motherboard is completely out of the computer and is not getting power right now, this battery is ensuring that it won't lose the date and time and some other things that are useful. Now, before I proceed, just as like a public service announcement, you should know these batteries, if they are original, if they date back to the 90s, they are notoriously prone to aging poorly and slowly leaking their battery acid out of the battery and into the circuitry around them. That has not happened on this machine. This is a new battery. It was just installed earlier this year. So I've got a good 15 years before I need to worry about the battery leaking. But a lot of computers of this era, even if they look like they're in great shape externally, they are dead or dying inside because these batteries are leaking. So if you have a vintage computer, or if you know anybody who does, please, please, please take the battery out. It's not doing you any good in there. It probably lost its ability to hold a charge many years ago, and it's literally a time bomb just waiting to go off and eat away all the circuitry on the motherboard. But anyways, public service announcement over. Here is the RAM for the computer, and you'll notice it even has a little sticker that says 32 MB. So this Mac has 32 megs of RAM, plus I think 4 megabytes built into the motherboard. So technically, it's actually a 36 megabytes of RAM configuration. And then these two sticks that sit right next to the RAM, they look kind of like RAM sticks from the era, but they're not. These are actually VRAM, or video RAM. So this machine has two 256 kilobyte VRAM sticks for a half meg of video memory, which allows it to run the monitor at 640 by 480 pixels at, I think, 8-bit color, but I need to double check that. So that's your grand tour of the motherboard. I guess the only thing I didn't really highlight is that all of the interconnectivity between the motherboard and the rest of the computer, the speakers, the circuitry for the hard drive, everything else, the CD-ROM drive, the floppy drive, all of the stuff the motherboard needs to communicate with is all connected using this giant edge connector on the back of the board. That's why I was able to just slide the board right out of the computer to work on it. There are a lot of faults that I can complain about with Apple's designs from the early to mid-90s, but this is kind of brilliant, and I wish modern computers still worked this way. It is so cool being able to just slide the motherboard out, do whatever you need to do, slap it back in there, and you're done. If you've ever tried building a modern PC and had to fiddle with the millions of little loose wires that have to be individually crimped into place, this is actually a pretty clever design that's long overdue for a comeback. So, with all that said, it is time. This is the full-bore 68040 processor with the floating point unit. This is the much weaker version with no floating point unit. It's time to break out my borrowed crowbar and see if I can gently lift the stock CPU out of the machine and replace it with the sample unit that I believe has a floating point unit. I've never done this before. I hope I don't break any of the pins on the bottom of the CPU. I'm going to take out the little styrofoam block for the replacement one so you can see what this looks like. But the bottom of the CPU is gold, or maybe copper, more likely, I'm not sure, but it has hundreds of little pins that are exceedingly delicate, and so I really don't want to break any of them on either CPU. I certainly want to keep the stock CPU in good shape because I don't know if this one works, and even if it does, one of my other Macs from the era might have a lower speed version of this same chip, so I might still end up using this one in a different computer. So I'm definitely going to try to be really gentle here as I do this, and I'm just kind of feeling my way through this. I'm going to try to use this little pry bar to lift the CPU out of its socket. This really feels very delicate. Oop, it just budged a little. So I'm just going to gently work my way around all four sides, trying to lift it up and out a little bit at a time. No need to rush. Doesn't really want to catch on all four sides, but of course I don't want to force it either. And I also don't want to break the pry bar that Old Pigeon from the forums loaned me, so I'm going to be really gentle here. Oh, interesting. I just got it to go all the way in. I wonder, there's also a little lip on the back of the pry bar which might be useful here as I try to just get the CPU lifted enough that the bigger comb side can actually catch underneath of it. That actually seems to be helping some. Making some progress, slowly. Ooh, okay, now it's starting to come loose. Now I'm going to try to lift it up from this side a little bit, and then back on this side a little bit. because of these these video RAM sticks over here, I can't really get any good leverage on this side of the chip. So I don't want to like put too much pressure on these VRAM sticks. So maybe I just take them out for now. Fortunately, they're held in by metal clips and not super brittle plastic clips. So that might make this a little bit easier. Oh yeah, now I've got a little bit of room I can keep prying with. Just keep working my way around the edges. Oh, look at that. It's out. Ta-da! Alright. Cool. So, I'm looking at the bottom actually. All of the pins look nice and straight. I don't see any bent pins. So, knock on wood, I think I extracted it without damaging anything. And now you can see the socket that the 040 CPU will sit in. And now, let's use some good luck here. And I'm just going to try to seat this back down into its spot. Gently lining up the pins with these holes, because as soon as I push down here, I'm kind of committing to it. And I don't want to bend any of the pins, because once they're bent, I don't know that I have the skills or the tools to unbend them. I'm just gently kind of putting a little bit of pressure on it, just to give it a little bit of oomph to sit into the slot, or into the socket rather. I'm going to look around the edges as closely as I can, just to make sure that nothing looks like it's out of alignment, because I really don't want to bend any of these pins. That would be pretty much a death sentence for the CPU and potentially the motherboard. If a pin breaks off in one of these holes, I don't know how I would ever fix that. I'd probably have to pay somebody who knows a lot more about this stuff than I do to desolder the socket and try to replace it. I don't know if that's even feasible. So I'm just going to gently kind of squeeze it until it sits down into the socket. There it goes. And that's it. It's not sitting as flat as the stock CPU was sitting. There's a tiny little gap, and the motherboard is flexing so much when I press on it. I'm a little nervous to put a lot of pressure on it. But, oh, there it goes. Now it's sitting a little better. Yeah, it's in there. All right, there we go. Whew! All right. So now that I've done that, I'm going to replace my video RAM. I don't think the machine will even boot without VRAM installed. I don't want to find out. And then pop in the second one again. And that's it. I'm going to take the original, the stock CPU, just put it right back into this little piece of foam that the replacement came in. I'm going to try to even use the same holes. Yeah, nice. All right. That is done. I'm going to put my Ethernet card back so I can cruise the information superhighway on my super beefed up, upgraded Mac Performa. And let's reinstall the motherboard back into the chassis of the computer. Swing this back over here. And hopefully you guys will get a good view of this, but the way it slots back in is just very elegant. From an era of Apple design where elegance was not particularly common, I really like this part of it. Just take the whole thing, slide it right back in, done. Replacement over. And because I like to jinx things, I'm going to put the back panel back on, because I'm just going to assume this upgrade worked perfectly. What could possibly go wrong? Alright, back panel reinstalled. Whoop, it's crooked. Let's do this right. There we go. Sweet. Okay, I'm going to hook everything back up and let's see if this worked. Alright, so I've got the power cable reconnected, got my ADB cable for my beloved Apple Extended Keyboard 2, best keyboard ever made. And everything's hooked up. I've got my SCSI to SD card plugged back into the SCSI port. I'm a little nervous. I'm a little nervous. I'm going to hit the power key on the keyboard and Either the machine's going to boot right up and show me that it's got a full-bore 68040 processor, or I've killed it, and then I will just cry for a long time, and this will be the saddest video I ever post to my channel. So we'll see. Fingers crossed. 3, 2, 1, please work. It chimed. Hot damn, that's a good sign. On Macs of this era, well, really Macs of any era, but especially of this era, the chime sound indicates that it passed its power on self-test, or post. So getting a post chime means that at least the machine is functioning enough to load the ROM image, it saw that it had RAM and VRAM installed and so on. So let's see if it boots. Oh, it's booting! If you have a Mac of this era yourself and you're still using a mechanical hard drive, you may notice how quiet this is. There's no moving parts other than the the cooling fan in here, because it's using that SCSI to SD card as its boot device. So super quiet and very fast. The machine will literally pull data off that card at the maximum speed that the SCSI bus can manage. And the computer has booted. It's loading a few little shareware things that I've been playing with from some Mac Addict magazine CD-ROMs. Thank you, Grant, for sending me a huge box of Mac Addict CD-ROMs. That's going to be a fun video that I'll be working on soon. And clear those little shareware warnings out. And now I'm going to do 2 quick tests here. First test, I'm going to run Apple System Profiler, which will tell me what CPU the machine believes it has right now. Fingers crossed. Hey, look at that. It's a full 68040 at 33 megahertz. No LC in there. Fantastic. That is great. And then let's do the other thing that I've been wanting to do, which is try to run this Extreme 3D demo, which, let's be real, this is a 33 megahertz computer. I don't expect this to work very well, but just seeing it load at all would be an improvement over what I had before, which was just an error message that the lack of a floating point unit was a fundamental line that this software could not cross. So let's see how the Extreme 3D application behaves now that there is a CPU with a floating point unit in this computer. We'll get the app to load now. It's actually working! And it's actually a Macromedia program. I didn't know that. The same folks that made Flash and a bunch of other cool stuff that was pretty influential on computer software design and internet content delivery for a long time. And here we have it. And this is an app that I frankly don't know how to use. I haven't read the manual yet. I literally have no idea how this works, but some of the icons look consistent with some other relatively early 3D design and animation applications that I've used before, so I'm going to take a kind of a quick guess at this. There's a big letter T, which usually means type, so I'm going to select that, see if we can create some text on here. There we go. And then I'll do this again, create another line beneath that. See if we can do something like this. Cool. So now we've got our Retro Roadshow text. I'm going to select all. And this button here looks like it's an extrude tool. Yeah, there's actually little tooltips along the bottom here that help out. So I can click this, and then it says click the first point of the extrude depth line or click to drag the line. I'm just going to click and drag and see if I can extrude all of this text. Just a little bit. And there we have it. So now we've got some text that has been extruded into a 3D shape. And I don't know what else I can do exactly, but we can try rendering this. Let's see what the final render setup will be. Good quality. Alright, sure, why not? And then let's render it. Oh, and I think on the view menu, I noticed once before, there is the option to align the camera to the view. So I'm going to do that now. So the camera will sort of take the place of the viewing window. And now if we try rendering this, let's see what happens. It's thinking about it. Very cool. We've got a somewhat 3D looking Retro Roadshow logo, which is a perfect match for my family's little organization. So very nice. It's a 3D design application working on a 68040 processor with a built-in FPU. Not bad. We have a 3D design and rendering program running on a Macintosh that it should not be running on, because we have now replaced the CPU in the machine. And I have no idea how to use this program, so I'm just goofing with it. But I think I just made an orb. Obviously I need to play with this program. I have no idea what I'm doing. But I'm just super excited. It's actually working. So thank you for following along. I hope this was interesting for you. If I find any more software that will run on this computer now because it has a floating point unit, I will happily post a follow-up video. But for now, I'm going to lose myself in playing with this very cutting-edge 3D rendering program from 1995. So thanks, and I'll see you next time.